With Black History Month almost upon us, the question we should all be asking ourselves in 2019 is how the party of Lincoln and emancipation became the party of Trump and white supremacy. It was a long and winding road that brought us to where we are today, and not surprisingly, that road runs right through South Carolina. The road starts in 1948, when the National Democratic Party put a civil rights plank in its convention platform. Southern delegates walked out of the Philadelphia Convention in protest. They met in Birmingham, Alabama, declared themselves to be the States' Rights Party, or the Dixiecrat Party as they came to be popularly known, and they named South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond as their presidential candidate, hoping to sink the National Democratic Party in the November election. It didn't work. The States' Rights Party carried only 4 Deep South states, including South Carolina, of course. Harry Truman was re-elected president, and Strom Thurmond was launched into national politics, where he would remain for the rest of his long, long life. And the first serious cracks appeared in the Democratic Solid South. In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signed the landmark Civil Rights Act, followed the next year by the Voting Rights Act. It's important to note that more Republicans supported these 2 monumental pieces of legislation than Democrats. Even in the mid-1960s, the Republican Party was still the party of Lincoln. In August 1964, Strom Thurmond, then a United States Senator, became the first important Democrat to switch parties, joining the GOP and campaigning for Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater. Goldwater carried South Carolina plus 4 southern states and his home state of Arizona. But Lyndon Johnson was re-elected in a landslide. But once the Solid South was shattered and the avalanche of Democrats falling to the Republican Party had begun. In 1966, Richard Nixon was in Columbia, sniffing the bushes and testing the waters for his presidential bid 2 years later. In the conference room at the downtown Wade Hampton Hotel, he delivered a furious law and order states' rights screed that worked the hall full of angry white men into a frothing frenzy, what his aide Patrick Buchanan called sweat, cigar smoke, and rage. After the speech, as Nixon and Buchanan were leaving, Nixon told his aide, "This is the future of the Republican Party, right here in the South." 2 years later at the Republican National Convention, it was Strom Thurmond who held South Carolina and other Southern delegates in line for Richard Nixon, when many of them wanted to bolt Ronald Reagan. Later that fall, it was Thurmond, again, who worked tirelessly to keep South Carolina and most of the South in the fold for Nixon. George Wallace carried 5 Deep South states, but Nixon won most of the South and a razor-thin victory in the November election. Nixon was always grateful to Thurmond for giving him the angry white vote in the 1968 GOP convention and the general election. Nixon brought with him to the White House a young staffer from Thurmond's office, who would spend the next 2 decades transforming the Republican Party. Harry Dent was born in Calhoun County in 1930, earned a degree from Presbyterian College, served a hitch in the Army during the Korean War, and joined Thurmond's staff in 1955. In the tumultuous late 1960s, Nixon sought to exploit racial and cultural divisions to become president. As his aide and future Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman, said, quote, "You have to face the fact the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes that while not appearing to." Engineering that sleight of hand was Harry Dent, the man who did more than any other to create the dog whistle politics of law and order, states' rights, of crime and welfare. As a special counsel and advisor to the Nixon White House, he helped communicate to white Southerners that Nixon would go slow on enforcing desegregation and would appoint conservative Southerners to the federal bench and the Supreme Court. It was part of what has come to be known as the Southern Strategy, and it was largely responsible for breaking the South out of the Democratic Party in 1968 and planting it firmly in the GOP. Most white Southerners still vote their racial prejudice a half-century later. Dent later advised Presidents Gerald Ford and George H.W. Bush and served as chairman of the South Carolina Republican Party. He was a deacon in the Southern Baptist Church, a clean-living, teetotaling Christian who left his law practice in 1981 to do Bible study. He and his wife started a lay ministry and helped build churches and orphanages in Romania. Perhaps no unelected person, not even Lee Atwater, did more than Harry Dent to create the modern GOP. Atwater was flash and dazzle, and his influence was brief. By contrast, Dent worked quietly, deep in the engine room of the Republican Party for decades. He represented the perfect blend of piety and cynicism, which has become the hallmark of the modern GOP. And while we're talking about the people who engineered the Southern takeover of the Republican Party, we cannot forget the aforementioned Lee Atwater. I've talked about Atwater in a previous video, which I hope you'll look up, but there's something else that should be mentioned. In 1981, Atwater sat down and recorded an interview with Professor Alexander Lamas of Case Western Reserve University. The interview was little noticed outside academic circles until it was published in The Nation magazine in 2012. In that interview, Atwater said this. Now don't quote me on this. You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes and these things. What you're talking about are totally economic things. And the byproduct often is that blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that's part of it. But I'm saying that it is getting that abstract and that coded that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut taxes is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, nigger. Thank you, Lee Atwater, for explaining 50 years of Republican strategy. And with that, I rest my case. In the last half century, the party of Lincoln has been transformed into the party of white supremacy, and it couldn't have happened without three South Carolinians, Strom Thurmond, Harry Dent, and Lee Atwater. If you like this video, check out my book, Living in Fear, Race, Politics, and the Republican Party in South Carolina. Find it at my website at wilmore.com.